before I hand over to Roshanak, I'm just gonna give a little bit of framing about the series and where I'm coming from as a curator and scholar. Just generally speaking, the purpose of the series is to think race in relation to the sonic and to critique the whiteness and global north focus of the scholarly sound studies canon, and to unsettle some theoretical and philosophical assumptions when it comes to listening, sound, silence, noise, and other related concepts and frameworks. Personally, for me, the background of this inquiry comes from many years of training and professional practice in classical and contemporary music, specifically voice, but other areas as well. And as I kind of moved out of that world and started to think and write more critically about those disciplines, it became very clear to me that there was a sort of disavowal of whiteness and race that was very central to the ways that those disciplines are taught and practiced. And so that's something that I'm now looking into further, specifically kind of looking at sound studies rather than classical music per se. And so that's something that I wanted to bring these great thinkers and scholars and practitioners together to talk about and to dig into. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce Roshanak Kheshti. Roshanak is an anthropologist, feminist, queer, and race theorist born in Tehran, Iran, and raised in Nashville, Tennessee. Her work sits at the intersection of sound, the senses, film, and performance studies with an emphasis on diaspora and psychoanalysis. She's the author of Modernity's Ear, Listening to Race and Gender in World Music with NYU Press, and Switched-on Bach with Bloomsbury Academic. She's currently completing her third book, tentatively titled We See with the Skin, Zora Neale Hurston's Synesthetic Hermeneutics. And she's previously published in the Radical History Review, American Quarterly, Current Musicology, Feminist Media Histories, Hypatia, Feminist Studies, GLQ, Theatre Survey, and Sounding Out. Roshanak, welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Sophie, and thank you to Colin for your tech support here today. Okay, part one. And this presentation is excerpted from one of the chapters of my manuscript in progress that Sophie referred to. It's called We See with the Skin. And the chapter is called Skin Sight, Skin Sound. Part one, Introduction. In 1925, Zora Neale Hurston submitted 6 short stories to the Opportunity Magazine writing contest, which would discover the likes of Langston Hughes, County Cullen, Claude McKay, Sterling Brown, and herself. I'll just pause to contextualize the figure that I'm going to be speaking of for those of you who aren't familiar with her. Zora Neale Hurston was a prominent Harlem Renaissance figure who's primarily known as a writer, specifically a writer of fiction in the form of novels and plays. But very few people know that she was an anthropologist by training. She was trained by the figure known as the father of American anthropology, Franz Boas. And she's a part of this sort of group that's referred to as the Boasian Circle, who influenced the kind of earliest foundations of American anthropology. So I've been drawn to her as a figure who has been underappreciated as an early anthropologist, as an African-American woman from the US South. And so the entire book is a reflection on a very curious 5 words that I encountered in one of her unpublished short stories. And so I'll explain that as well. 3 of her stories, Color Struck, Drenched in Light, and Spunk, were chosen for publication. Of the unpublished stories was Black Death, which opens, quote, "We Negroes in Eatonville know a number of things that the hustling, bustling white man never dreams of. He is a materialist with little care for overtones. They have only eyes and ears. We see with the skin." Black Death would not be published for another 70 years, making its way into the 1995 anthology Zora Neale Hurston, The Complete Stories, edited by Henry Louis Gates Jr. And then in 1996, in the anthology Harlem's Glory, Black Women Writing, edited by Roses and Randolph. An important and unexplained difference between the two publications is the omission of the sentence, "They have only eyes and ears, we see with the skin," from the 1995 publication. I became entranced by the variously appearing and disappearing published versions of Hurston's short story. I'd been working on a manuscript on Hurston's wildly experimental methodology for the better part of a decade. This line, like a flashing neon light, arrested me in my tracks. Why the critical 5 words around which I organize this book appear and disappear like a specter over the course of its revision remains a mystery. Nevertheless, I read in those 5 words a revelation that changes how I perceive race and embodiment. My manuscript, We See with the Skin, Zora Neale Hurston's Synesthetic theory, pays homage to the revelation by elaborating upon its significance. But can one write a book about 5 words? Or why write a book based on 5 words from a short story titled Black Death in 2024? Within the seemingly pessimistic story, Hurston buried a seed for what Fred Moten traces as, quote, "the aesthetics of the Black radical tradition," and aesthetics that I interpret as synesthetic. Hurston's contributions to aesthetic theory have been missed because she never didactically spelled them out, but rather performed them. The short story Black Death is a skin through which her aesthetic theory can be systematically fleshed out. As a neuropsychological diagnosis, synesthesia is described as the crisscrossing of sense perceptions, such that colors may be tasted, heard as audible, visualized, or felt. But in Hurston's work, synesthesia represents a social and political condition, one in which Black skin can see. I became interested in the idea of synesthesia over 20 years ago through Alan Merriam's 1964 book, The Anthropology of Music, where he differentiates what he calls true synesthesia from culturally derived synesthesia. True synesthesia can be summarized as the neurological condition described above, while culturally derived, or what he also calls forced synesthesia, is variable cross-culturally, but tends to be consistent within a culture, as in cases where geographic directions or musical scales correspond to colors. Anthropologist David Howes has theorized a similar distinction between what he calls constitutional synesthesia, or the pathologization of individual cases of synesthesia within neuropsychology, and cultural synesthesia, the historical materialist account of sensibility as a product of a social body and its environment. The notions of cultural or forced synesthesia are relevant to Hurston's pronouncement, "we see with the skin," because we are distinguished from them who have only eyes and ears, elaborated upon in the second paragraph. For instance, if a white person were halted on the streets of Orlando and told that Old Man Morgan, the excessively Black Negro hoodoo man, can kill any person indicated and paid for without ever leaving his house or even seeing his victim, he'd laugh in your face and walk away, wondering how long the Negro will continue to wallow in ignorance and superstition. But no Black person in a radius of 20 miles will smile. Not much. They know. We see with the skin is not only a theory about a social body with a forced cultural synesthesia, but it is a theory of racialization as well. Hurston's synesthetic theory takes not only culture and history into account, but power and race. Jacques Rancière asks, quote, who has a part in the community of citizens, unquote, within the hegemonic distribution of the sensible? Inclusion into a mainstream political order requires the adoption of ways of seeing, notions of space and time, proper speech, and characterizations of noise that are preordained. Failing to do so results in exclusion from the common sense and hence the political order organized through that shared sensibility. That there could be a way of seeing with skin practiced outside of a white supremacist common sense that is world-making and legitimating of Blackness is a radical ontological supposition. We see with the skin describes a collective form of sensibility, limited to a we whose experience does not officially count as aesthetic. The etymological origins of synesthesia in the Greek prefix syn, sin, meaning together, and root aesthesis, meaning feeling, are instructive for how I define Hurstonian synesthesia. Together feeling. So this concept allows me to think sensibility outside of the structuralist model of the senses that link the body's modes of perception to particular organs, corresponding eyes with seeing, ears with hearing, and etc. And two, allows for a sensibility that goes beyond the individual to the collective body sensing as one. Hurston's brand of synesthesia is centered around a commonly held sensibility shared by, quote, any Black person within a radius of 20 miles, unquote, from Orlando, Florida. Hurston's performance ethnographies render what Jacques Rancière would, decades after Hurston, proclaim, quote, aesthetic acts as configurations of experience that create new modes of sense perception and induce novel forms of political subjectivity, unquote. In its capacity to create new modes of perception, sense perception, Hurston's work was world-making and productive because it was a reflection of the world-making practices of the communities she engaged. Hurston chronicled Southern Black aesthetic acts as vehicles for novel forms of political subjectivity. I call this synesthetic because she overtly reroutes visual perception from the eyes to the skin in a manner that grants a keener Black perception. I interpret this to be a critique of the concept of double consciousness developed by her elder, W.E.B. Du Bois, who claimed in 1903, quote, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Like Du Bois, who narrates a racialized condition gifted with second sight, Hurston reimagines the skin as a privileged vantage point. But unlike Du Bois, Hurston understands seeing with the skin as a self-consciousness arising through a we that deploys a skin sight to create a collective interiority rather than a consciousness that doubles vision or one that bars her from, as Du Bois puts it, true self-consciousness. Double consciousness centers whiteness and the hegemonic white gaze. Seeing with the skin activates a mode of perception that is uniquely Black and Southern, centering a Black skin gaze or a Black skin that is seeing. This is a cultural synesthesia hidden in plain sight, enabling a Black epistemology to function without being policed by Jim Crow. Jim Crow was the apartheid order in the post-Reconstruction South prior to the civil rights, various civil rights amendments that were declared in the 1950s and 60s. Seeing with the skin is a theory of synesthesia or together feeling that is both an embodied intersensoriality, or multiple senses working harmoniously to heighten the body's feeling capacities, as well as a collective sensibility where multiple bodies connect in sentiment, producing a supersensibility not reducible to the sum of its parts. This is similar to what Jana Brown has identified as the work of Black utopias, writing, quote, "In feeling together, people experience themselves outside of a binary relation to official, legal, juridical powers, and instead as part of an alternative sociality," unquote. Synesthesia describes sensory and aesthetic phenomena that upset and or disrupt the preeminence of the liberal humanist ego, that possessive individual constituted in opposition to its others, the self who is proprietor of a singular free will. The next section is called Skin Sight. Within this potentially earliest work of fiction, Hurston foreshadows an elaborate ethnographic project she would embark upon only 3 years later in her study of spirit possession within African diasporic religious practices. Between 1927 and 1929, Zora Neale Hurston made 9 16mm short films in Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. A little over a decade later, she made another 3, possibly more films in South Carolina between April and May of 1940, an excursion that also included audio recording and ethnographic interviews. As she had with other mediums, Hurston jumped directly into the film fray, experimenting with her own filmmaking style and employing strategies of representational refusal in her filmmaking, similar to what I have called her phonographic refusal in her audio recordings for the WPA, where rather than pointing her microphone at others, she recorded herself singing African American folk songs. She rejected the then formal conventions of both narrative and ethnographic cinema, creating instead an archive in which Black subjects are depicted in unstaged quotidian scenes that feature them in motion and engaging in direct address with the camera. These are soundless reels, but there is ample noise making within the frame. And this particular version, which I grabbed from YouTube, which is a very random montage of a number of her films that are actually not published and only exists at the Library of Congress. It has juxtaposed some of her audio recordings, which were made in different settings, and so it's an arbitrary juxtaposition. So I'm just going to turn the audio off, and then in the Q&A, if anyone's interested in hearing some audio, I'm happy to share some of that, but I'm just going to turn it off for now. And so you can observe her film reels from this one in particular is from 1928. These are soundless reels, but there is ample noise making within the frame, with subjects talking often directly to Hurston just behind the camera, singing, stomping, or screaming in the case of children, with movement, dance, clapping, shouting, tambourine shaking, guitar strumming, as well as natural and environmental sounds like wind, water, leaves, cooking, cars, and chopping wood. Where these films were screened is unknown. Presumably, they never received a wide audience and may have only been viewed by a small handful of people, if that. Of particular importance here is how these quote unquote silent films have synesthetic capacities, how they resonate and reverberate even now. Hurston's films are technically silent. Tina Kamp's work on listening to images establishes a method for hearing resonance that, in the context of reading photographs, that are ostensibly considered silent, providing a method for listening to silent films. Kamp argues, quote, The choice to listen to rather than simply look at images is a conscious decision to challenge the equation of vision with knowledge by engaging photography through a sensory register that is critical to Black Atlantic cultural formations. Sound. Sound need not be heard to be perceived. Sound can be listened to, and in equally powerful ways, sound can be felt. It both touches and moves people. In this way, sound must therefore be theorized and understood as a profoundly haptic form of sensory contact. Kant's synesthetic thesis leans in to listen to what she describes as quiet photographs. This interpretive method enables me to hear Hurston's so-called silent films as reverberant with sound. It is especially through her emphasis on shouting, in Hurston's emphasis on shouting, which I'll elaborate on in just a little bit, as a loud performance of spirit represented in a number of different environments by a number of different subjects. The possession of dancers, some of whom are children, ecstatically moved in a manner that makes them seem to levitate, or the shouting of congregants of the commandment keeper church, whose spirit possession Hurston connects to quote unquote African possession by the gods. That her films move forward in time to the sounds of the subjects on film, not beholden to standard reels per second, and in no way limited to the medium's muteness. This is a radical departure from how silent cinema is otherwise read through the delimiting of silent film sound to score and sound effects. Instead, I offer a non-empirical reading practice of resonance that went unrecorded, existing as synesthetic sensation in the form of Black loudness. And the next section is called Black loudness. Hurston's film, South Carolina, May 1940, Commandment Keeper Church. This, what you're seeing here is not the film that I'm talking about. This is just one of the reels of her children's games. Commandment Keeper Church is a silent film that shouts, one that is visibly loud. It is synesthetic on multiple levels, but there are two divergent ways in which Blackness sounds here. For one, the loudness emerges from the long-held white supremacist synesthetic associations of Black speech and loud talking with Black skin and loudness. Quote unquote, loud talk, in Geneva Smitherman's words, is an expressive practice embraced in Black English for its capacity to resist the respectable volume of white English. She writes, quote, white over emotionalism and excessively strong feeling becomes soul, eagerly embraced and passionately pursued in the world of Black English speakers. Loud talk, too flashy dress and behavior become in the Black cultural universe the much valued stylin and profilin, unquote. Smitherman's reiteration of key ideas Hurston identified in relation to Black English in her widely lauded essay, Characteristics of Negro Expression, amplifies the voluminous nature of this expression, how it resonates both sonically as well as visibly, resulting in the filmic representation of Black skin as resonance. And here in this particular reel, this is Reverend George Washington, who is the pastor at the Commandment Keeper Church, and some of his parishioners being baptized, likely in the Atlantic Ocean because of the geographic location of their church, which is in, I forget the name of the town in South Carolina. In every case, her silent films ostensibly present silent shouting. Yet, as I have argued, Black skin's indexicality of loudness, juxtaposed against the shouting taking place within the frame, makes possible a haptic visuality or skin sight and a listening to the image or skin sound that furthers her claim, we see with the skin. This agential form of expression that flouts white genteel standards of volume and speech has historically been interpreted through racist standards of respectability as uncouth behavior. Black skin is indexically made audible within this discursive system, a dark skin color made visibly loud, the way that bright colors are said to be loud. Sean Crawley has genealogically traced this to Enlightenment aesthetic hierarchies of distinction, which correlate the color black with noise, writing, quote, "Fuscous color, a term used by Edmund Burke to describe the sublime, coalesces with loud sound. Blackness is noise," unquote. This is akin to what musicologist Nina Sun-Eidsheim has referred to as sonic blackness, a phenomenon she applies to operatic timbre, in which, quote, "visual blackness was projected onto auditory timbre, resulting in the perception of sonic blackness," unquote. So there are two genealogies for the audibility of black skin. One, a racist surveillance order that polices black skin, speech, and volume by equating them all. And two, what Campt refers to as the sensory register critical to Black Atlantic cultural formations, sound. Nevertheless, in both cases, blackness sounds. These silent shouting films represent what Sean Crawley has called a joyful noise, which he describes as, I don't have that one. Quote, "a critique of the given world, a political economy of austerity and exploitation. Black Pentecostals are sounding out a way, rehearsing a mode of sonic production that refuses origin and purity, utilizing melismatic, melodic eruption, irreducible noise. That noise can be joyful is an important claim to make. Noise is a fundamental feature of Black Pentecostal aesthetics, and as such is a likewise illustration of the choreosonic itinerary and protocol of Blackness," unquote. There are competing frameworks for auditing Black loudness, either as noise or as joy. As Crawley convincingly argues, Black Pentecostal shouting is a vociferous refusal of this association between blackness and noise, representing instead joy to the initiated, writing, quote, "to make noise, to make it joyfully, is to criticize the epistemology of Western civilization, to critique the coloniality of being, power, truth, freedom, to perform an intervention into the object, the theme, and the transcendental subject of history," unquote. Next section is Black Sounds of Silent Film. Hurston notes the reverberant and rhythmic nature of her subject matter in the manuscript, quote, "ritualistic expression from the lips of the communicants of the Seventh-day Church of God, Beaufort, South Carolina." That's the title of the manuscript. Associated with her 1940 film, Commandment Keeper Church, Beaufort, South Carolina. This highly ambitious fieldwork expedition resulted in multimodal documentation, including film, sound recording, and an unpublished manuscript, which to this day have not been synchronized and exist as separate archival objects held in different collections at the Library of Congress. Hurston begins the manuscript by foregrounding the rhythmic nature of this congregation in an opening note. Quote, "This Seventh-day Church of God holiness is a further or newer step in the sanctified church in the United States. To the interviewer, this church seems to be a protest against the stereotyped form of Methodist and Baptist churches among Negroes. It is a revolt against the white man's view of religion, which has been so generally accepted by the literate Negro, and is therefore a version of the more African form of expression. Its keynote is rhythm. In this church, they have 2 guitars, 3 cymbals, 2 tambourines, 1 pair of rattlegoers, and 2 washboards. Every song is rhythmic, as are their prayers and their sermons," unquote. South Carolina 1940 Commandment Keeper Church is a series of documentary reels about the synesthetic experience of entrancement, of hearing things, of seeing things, of cavorting with spirits and their possession of the congregants, of speaking in tongues, of ecstasy, of vision. Hurston's roles are many: congregant, faithful, parishioner, seeker, saint, director, ethnographer. Unlike her other films, Hurston is not the camera operator on this expedition, but functions more like a director who is within the frame, a member of the parish very much engaged in ecstatic rapture. Throughout the various reels, Hurston is within the frame, bearing witness to what Lee Eric Schmidt calls hearing things, and as a performance ethnographer, hearing things for herself and bearing witness to her interlocutors' auditory and visual hallucinations. The church's rhythmicity is sensible in the film, both as a result of the motion picture of congregants engaged in song, Pastor George Washington engaged in sermon, as well as the rhythmicity of Black English evident in the orality on display and the speaking in tongues depicted in the film. Hurston's job as the film's director and expedition leader is also to envision the congregants' visions. As the film's main entranced subject, Julia Jones, conveys to Hurston in an interview, quote, "In a trance, things change. Your eyes are changed. You see and hear. The Lord have come to my bed and poured the power out on me. The Lord have shown me some of the most wonderful things I ever seen in my life," unquote. These synesthetic events lead Hurston to parenthetically note, quote, "She is a prophet. The prophecy is very important in this ritual. Note the similarity of African witch smelling," unquote. Entrancement facilitates prophecy, a state of being that enables communication with the divine. This entrancement is further elaborated upon in her essay Shouting, where she argues for the African origins of this Christian practice, writing, quote, "There can be little doubt that shouting is a survival of the African possession by the gods. In Africa, it is sacred to the priesthood of acolytes. In America, it has become generalized. The implication is the same, however. It is a sign of special favor from the spirit that it chooses to drive out the individual consciousness temporarily and use the body for its expression. In every case, the person claims ignorance of his actions during the possession. Broadly speaking, shouting is an emotional explosion, responsive to rhythm. It is called forth by 1, sung rhythm, 2, spoken rhythm, 3, humming rhythm, 4, the foot patting or hand clapping that imitates very closely the tom-tom. Hurston goes on to distinguish forms of shouting in a manner that is particularly apt to the interpretation of Hurston's films, writing, quote, "There are two main types of shouters. 1, silent. 2, vocal," unquote. Hurston's theory of silent and vocal shouting provides the framework through which to interpret the sonicity of her silent films. Whether silent or vocal, shouting is the means of prophesizing, and the shout is the medium and materiality that indexes spirit possession. Whether silent or vocal, shouting is the means, neither the veracity of the spirit possession nor its communication and expression are altered by the volume or audibility of sound to others. Instead, shouting, whether silent or vocal, represents the performance of possession, and its rhythmicity and sound are conveyed nevertheless. Thus, shouting, especially in silent form, is synesthetic, inspiring the auditor to hear the shout. And I just ended the slideshow. I don't have any more slides. In the case of Hurston's films, audition takes place in what I have elsewhere termed the aural imaginary. Silent films invoke sound in the perceiver. As I explore in modernity's ear, the aural imaginary theorizes the imaginary order sonically, unquote, and allows for an investigation into the projective nature of listening. In the case of Hurston's silent films, the visibility of Black figures within the frame sets into motion Eidsheim's perception of sonic Blackness in a manner that is loud, that shouts. But when we couple this with Hurston's own theory of silent shouting, we are given further tools with which to interpret these silent films as a reverberant event beyond the discursive frame of the aural imaginary. In the oft-quoted line from her ethnography, Mules and Men, quote, "Mouths don't empty themselves unless the ears are sympathetic and knowing," unquote. Hurston presents a theory of the Derridian concept of the ear of the other as the site of signification and the Bakhtinian notion of dialogism. The speaker carefully calibrates speech in relation to the auditor. So on the one hand, there is the projective listening that she widely criticizes in the work of white anthropologists and ethnomusicologists and popular authors who mine Black culture to satisfy their own fantasies. Quote, "That is why these voodoo ritualist orgies of Broadway and popular fiction are so laughable. The profound silence of the initiated remains what it is. Hoodoo is not drum beating and dancing. There are no moon worshippers across the Negroes in America," unquote. Or even among the Black literati who go in search of sorrow songs. In every case, her silent films ostensibly present silent shouting, yet as I have argued, Black skin's indexicality of loudness, juxtaposed against the shouting taking place within the frame, makes possible a skin sight and skin sound that furthers her claim we see with the skin. I'm just going to skip ahead a little here in the interest of time. Okay, I'm going to skip to the section called Skin Sound. The audio recordings from the Commandment Keeper Church expedition are no less evasive, engaging what I've elsewhere called Hurston's sonic infidelity. Whether by virtue of the technology or the presence of spirits, the recordings sound possessed, defying the listener's desire for fidelity. Constant skipping, miscut grooves, wow and flutter, and acoustic anomalies give the impression of trance-like audition. My listening notes attest to this from the audio recording of the expedition made by recordist Norman Chalfin. Very scratchy recording. First begins with extremely percussive beats, then changes to a spiritual. Let's see. Sean Crawley charts a genealogy for Black Pentecostal shouting that originates as a necessity among Sea Island coastal Maroon communities, of which Beaufort, South Carolina is a part, to exist in secrecy and exile. These exiled Maroons were free to practice their syncretized Muslim Christian shout traditions in secrecy, even if at times strategically silent. Maroons were structurally and economically separated from those who remained on plantations and settled inland post-emancipation. And this resulted, as Hurston suggests, in the sanctified church forming in contradistinction to Methodist and Baptist traditions, which are the main Black spiritual congregations within Christianity in the US. Black linguist and one-time mentor to Hurston, Lorenzo Dow Turner, would conclude about the Georgia and South Carolina Sea Island tradition of the Gullah peoples that movement, sound, and circumambulation established the ring shout tradition. Crawley's concept of choreosonics further theorizes the Islamic origins of the ring shout and the circumambulatory movement around the Kebbeh, the counterclockwise motion in which bodies move as one life force, and the movement that coincides with shouting among Black Pentecostals. Thus, movement in the Islamic tradition of counterclockwise movement around the mostly holy site of the Kebbeh coincided with Black Pentecostal shouting as one choreosonic event. This movement and sound resound in Hurston's silent films, as well as in her audio recordings. In The Sanctified Church, likely written later but unpublished during her lifetime, Hurston makes a similar claim, writing, quote, "The Negro has not been Christianized as extensively as is generally believed. The great masses are still standing before their pagan altars and calling old gods by a new name. And as evidence of this, note the drum-like rhythm of all Negro spirituals. All Negro-made church music is dance possible," unquote. Okay, just in conclusion, Hurston's multimodal performance ethnography among parishioners of the Commandment Keeper Church in 1940 has left numerous co-presences on record, evidence of not only a pan-spiritualism, but the ongoing possession of the recording itself. Her commitment to understanding dispossession led her to possession, which can be understood as one of the key contributions of her body of work. Not only were her interlocutors possessed, not only was she possessed, but the records she has left behind remain so as well. I explore Hurston's commitment to possession through conjure work in the other chapters in the book, and the influence this has had on Black feminist theory. Thank you.
Thank you, Roshanak. If anybody has a question, you can just ask it like through your microphone and speaking, or feel free to also use the chat. And while you're thinking, it would be really nice to hear what you referred to before, some of those recordings, those sound recordings that you mentioned. I found some of these videos and also noticed that they seem to be unrelated sound field recordings kind of overlaid.
Yes. So other than the last film that I was just referring to, The Commandment Keeper Church, to my knowledge, there was no audio recorded with these other reels. Okay, so I'll play it with the sound on this time.
Zora Hurston speaking. Zora Hurston speaking. In all the big work camps, mills and turpentine steel and road camps and whatnot, they have a man to go around and wake up the camp. And he has various chants and hollers to wake them up, and sometimes he makes them up as he goes along. Well, I heard these at Lochman, a big sawmill down in Polk County. Wake up, get on the run, ain't quiet day, but it's 5 o'clock. Come on that cover, bullets. Come on up on that cover, unless you want some trouble with the walker. Come on. Wake up, Jacob. Days are breaking. Catch a whole big of bacon and your shirt is shaking. Wake up, for the show. Big crowd game on the other side, and I know you want to go. Oh, they didn't hear. Oh, thought I heard somebody shout. Horse up the window, let the thing go out. Oh, horse up the window, let the thing go out. I do not want it in here.
So that's Hurston herself.
Yes.
Yeah. And what was the sort of, was there a specific kind of framework or purpose of these recordings and these trips?
Yeah. So these were various expeditions in the 1930s, mostly associated with a project under the Works Progress Administration, which was a Depression era kind of New Deal supported initiative to establish at the same time opportunities for employment in a depression era kind of US, where those opportunities had dwindled, and also to engage in a kind of salvage project of capturing folk traditions that were perceived to be at risk of extinction due to rapid industrialization, due to the great migrations of African Americans who were leaving the South for various cities in the North and West. So these were, this was a very wide scale, sort of a large scale initiative, and Hurston was hired as a part of the team in the Florida and Georgia expeditions. And she was doing something that no one else was doing, which was recording herself singing, as opposed to recording the members of the communities that were being, engaged through the, expeditions.
That's really interesting. I really like the idea of sonic infidelity, and just in general as a kind of framework of thinking about field recording and what field recording is and what it's for and what its histories are. And it just had me thinking kind of about the idea of fidelity as a kind of form of or productive of whiteness in sonic practice, maybe because of the way that it sort of relatively invisibilizes the technological mediation of listening there. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that and about the kind of perhaps connection between these recording practices and sort of certain Western or Enlightenment epistemologies.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so the epilogue of my first book, Modernity's Ear, is contemplating these uncharacteristic recording practices that I encountered in Hurston's archive that I did not find elsewhere in any of the early comparative musicology recordings that I had been consulting in the sort of genealogy that I was charting in that project, which was trying to sort of theorize the idea of world music and listening, etc. And so one of the things that I pursue in that chapter is the consideration of the notion of fidelity and its relationship to the idea of realism. And the I think it's much more widely accepted when we think about visual art and realism, that it's hyper constructed, right? That realism is hyper constructed, and that it is an aesthetic form, that we call realism. Whereas in sound recording, that awareness is lacking. That there remains to be a commitment to what is referred to as fidelity, which is the idea that there is a correspondence between the recording and the source, and that there is no media kind of infiltration in the recording. And so I talk about that truism, which is both a kind of recording industry standard, and so many so many pieces of hardware within the music and sort of recording industry are designed to maximize fidelity. And the anomaly of Hurston's choice to depart from this commitment to fidelity. So if we're thinking about field recordings, by definition, field recordings can only be fidelous when the context is a part of the recording, and that context is imagined to be the soundscape, the environment, and the folk, whether it's indigenous or Black folk, were very much conflated with the environment. And so that her choice to sing the songs herself completely departed from that really taken for granted standard practice. And so I attempt to theorize that, and I refer to that as her sonic infidelity.
I'll just say if anyone would like to post questions in the chat, we can also read them out. It's another method.
Yeah. Crowley's idea of the choreosonic is also really fascinating. Also, just makes me think of the choros, like that in ancient theater actually did mean both song and dance, and then eventually in the various etymological paths it took came to mean two distinct things. I think Colin Ashton actually spoke at the first lines of flight, right?
Yeah, that was, yeah, we had him last year.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that really interesting, and the interconnectivity of movement and sound. And actually, I was just thinking if even there's a kind of implication for disciplinary boundaries and reification in thinking about artistic practices, but in kind of institutional spaces more generally. Like if there's something about Black studies and Black aesthetics, the study of Black aesthetics, that kind of gives us a roadmap for looking beyond disciplinary divisions.
Yeah, I think that, through this project, as I have explored her claim, we see with the skin, it fundamentally challenges the organization of the five senses. And so if we think about the disciplines, the art, the West sort of European art disciplines, they correspond to the senses.
Right.
And although, proprioception is not one of those, right? So, sort of kinesis and proprioception, which I think are really important to dance, are not really captured in the five senses. And so I think dance studies, by definition, is such an interestingly interdisciplinary field because it has to pull from music, it has to pull from theater, it has to pull from biology and science and technology studies, because yes, we do have movement historically organized under the discipline of dance in the Western European art canon, but outside of various canonized figures whose choreography becomes centered, we don't have a disciplinary study of dance the way that we have with music, the way that we have with theater, for example. So yeah, I think in this idea of the choreosonic that Crowley is promoting, in the idea of seeing with the skin, these are examples of sensory and sort of these are sensibilities, let's say, that completely demand a different disciplinary approach to understanding them than the traditional disciplinary structure that we have, let's say at the university, you know, in the academy. And, you know, that's one of the things that I'm really interested in thinking about with this project.
I'll just read a question or a comment. Okay. With regards to the presentation, there is an exhibition touring from the British Library to Huddersfield about Black British music. And there's a link in there if anyone wants to follow that. Because Huddersfield is important in this history, and there's a launch event at the Chestnut Centre tomorrow. So if anyone, okay, so you can connect with this person with, sorry, it's not showing me Lauren. There have been some meetings to try and make sure people from the Jamaican and Grenadian communities are fully involved. And it would be good for any researchers here who have an interest or a stake to get involved. Nice, thank you. Next question. The conception of synesthesia you advanced in the beginning of your talk relies in the first place on the recognition of a visual sign to conjure in the imagination of the viewer a sound. In other words, it is a cross-sensory experience that is, at least in my understanding of what you said, initiated by a response to the visual field, so moving film. You touched on it briefly at the end, but I would be interested in knowing how sound rather than sight can be used to initiate these synesthetic experiences. In other words, how can sound without any visual reference or musical stylistic tropes make us imagine discrete socio-racial contextually situated forms of meaning, history, or experience, etc.? The point you made about choreosonic events or movement sounds is indeed one very interesting way of thinking about this. And could you say more about that? I guess thinking about fidelity, glitches, etc., could be another way of gesturing towards this in an abstract way.
Well, I guess what I would do is refer back to, I guess it was a section that I had to skim, and so perhaps it wasn't kind of adequately developed, but in working with these the audio recordings from the 1940 expedition that Hurston undertook, and encountering in these recordings at the Library of Congress a sense of their, as a result of, sure, technical phenomena that we could easily explain away, that sound engineers and sound recordists have particular language for. Like, for example, and I can read some of this. Okay, so on these recordings, some of the sound recordists and archivists actually are recording themselves. And so one of them says, there are grooves that oscillate in strange ways. And the disc is replete with wow and flutter. And, you know, over the course of the historical transition between forms of software like the wax cylinder, like the acetate disc, like the reel-to-reel, there are so-called artifacts that remain from transitioning from one medium to another. And so when you encounter on record these various, whether they're explained away as artifacts, or whether they have to do with the degradation of the medium, or perhaps they were present in the initial recording because we would never know, that becomes a moment, I think, of auditory synesthesia that, at least in the case of these recordings, which is specifically about a scene of spirit possession, that event of possession, which is, you know, described as a kind of evacuation of the body. That event of possession becomes enacted in this audio, in this sound recording. So that's one example that comes to mind.
I haven't really formulated a question entirely, but I think this idea of sound recording as something, it's capturing and almost and maintaining, as you say, as things are digitalized and archived, these histories and cultures of people that possibly aren't around anymore. I mean, especially with this recording of songs from the early 1900s. And yeah, what are your thoughts on, I suppose, this erasure of culture that can come along with not pointing the sound recording device, but then on the other hand, either like a fetishization of capturing a culture by aiming the recording device and continuing to archive these things and refer back to them.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess one example that comes to mind in thinking about that is an example that I talk about in Modernity's Ear. So as a result of a number of initiatives funded by the US government from, roughly the late 19th century, all the way through the mid 20th century, the Library of Congress holds thousands upon thousands of cultural objects that are sonic, right? So audio recordings of individuals who are members of communities that are perceived to be at risk. And in my field of anthropology, this practice is referred to as salvage ethnography. And that, is very kind of critically, discussed in terms of ethics, right? That when there is this constructed, this sort of construct of scarcity, as in, something or some practice is bound for extinction, then various ethical protocols that would otherwise be practiced are sort of left by the wayside. And there's more of a kind of dredging of cultural knowledge that happens. And so in this period from around 1898 through the 1950s is that period of time, that period of salvage. So in the 1970s, the Library of Congress engaged in something known as the Federal Cylinder Project, which was an attempt to repatriate some of these recordings to the communities that were understood to have been the descendant communities of the individuals on record or of the practices that were recorded. And the really interesting thing that came out of this project was that a very, very large percentage of Indigenous communities refused to accept these recordings. They actually they determined that these were not their ancestors. And that's not because there was a technical error in terms of that genealogy, but it was a refusal of the, first of all, idea of fidelity, that somehow this was a fidelist kind of representation of their cultural ancestry. But also, the idea that that they had been desacralized, that these performances had been desacralized through this process of capture. And so they were actually, you know, potentially ominous to the community if they were to this varies, you know, by community, tribe by tribe, family by family. It's in no way a general condition, but I think that example reveals that what is perceived, let's say, by the federal government as a kind of innocent, you know, catalog, right? Which is how the archive, capital A, has always imagined itself, as this sort of benevolent site that captures for posterity a set of knowledges that would otherwise be lost. To think that that would be perceived as a form of violence by a particular community, I think helps to reframe the phenomenon of recording itself. That, in fact, what if we rethought what if we rethought recording, you know, not just as inherently good, which is sort of how this period imagined it. And we thought about the archive as not just inherently good, because of the way that the capital A archive, I'm talking about Library of Congress, for example, it severs the you know, what Jessica Bissett-Perea, who's an ethnomusicologist at UC Davis, she calls the relations that are held with sound by some indigenous communities, that the sounds themselves are relations, that these more than human, you know, these more than human sort of sounds are not just sort of forms of information, but they are relations of those in that kind of sacred order. So I think it's you know, it begs greater scrutiny. You know, the kind of the ubiquity of audio recording begs greater scrutiny.
Thank you. That's
Yeah,
really
great. Thank you. That's really
Yeah.
interesting.
I wasn't aware of this term, salvage ethnography. That's really fascinating. A few more questions. I'd love to hear how or whether synesthetic analysis converses with decolonial aesthesis. If that's something you could speak.
I would love to hear more about decolonial aesthesis.
Yeah. Do you want, is Emilia still here? Maybe you could write a bit more about that, Emilia, while we look at the next question, and then we can come back to that. So these recordings are so powerful and important. What do you think they offer to contemporary music practice? How can these interwoven aesthetics and techniques offer to current musical or performance practice? And given the ethics of capture and appropriation, how can and should that question be asked and explored in practice? And then maybe rather than taking them as separate, I'll just read part 2. A similar question in relation to the current practice of the university, following on Sophie's question about disciplinarity. What do these recordings also tell us about how to break down and reconfigure those disciplines? Not just that they need to be bridged, but can we imagine other institutional forms that might be more adequate than the kinds of ways we now have to engage with them? Those are closely related, so could be asked together.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, with regard to new and contemporary music, you know, the question of repatriation, which is something that's, you know, an incredibly important debate happening in museums around the world, certainly in the UK, which is probably one of the greatest. I mean, the British government is, the Crown is one of the greatest hoarders of global antiquities. And so I hope that these discussions are being had in your circles. But certainly in the US, where Congress passed a law in 1993, which at this point is, a long time ago, called the Native American Repatriation, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And this law requires institutions that receive public monies to ensure that their holdings are, that they are not holding culturally sensitive objects that were acquired by dubious means in like 99.9% of cases. So that has resulted in a lot of interesting debates and discussions about these recordings that I was just talking about, and the relationship between sound and repatriation. And so there's a really interesting record that I would, that comes to mind as one example of a kind of reckoning with this, as a form of aesthetic practice. And it's an album by Jeremy Dutcher, who is a Wallastack person in contemporary Canada. And on this record, I'm just looking for the name of the record. On this record, let's see here. On the record, he has several recordings with an ancestor, Wallastack ancestor, and that ancestor's wax cylinder recordings are on the recording itself. He's an opera singer, Jeremy Dutcher. And so, that is, I think a really interesting example of both the question of repatriation as well as how a contemporary practitioner is reckoning with these really thorny and complicated debates. So I guess the second part of the question, in terms of institutions, yeah, I mean, my disciplinary home is performance studies, and that field is kind of, it has this claim to fame, which is it's an undisciplined. And so, thinking about perhaps how performance studies is trying to reckon with the disciplinary divisions that have arbitrarily, left us with, a music department that doesn't interact with, a theater department, for example. And by institution, I'm assuming this is an academic institution that we're talking about. So, there's a lot of pressure being put on this right now. And I think it's an exciting time for this question. And so I think it's very much like to be determined.
Yeah, so I could read out this next question that's popped up. Sorry, Sophie, I think you were muted, so
Of course, go for it.
yeah, so I'll jump in there. So Andrea says, I wanted to ask if you could speak more about phonographic refusal, as this concept is new to me. I've also come across it very recently in an article I have not yet read, which I am sharing in case anyone is also interested. This is titled The Practice of Refusal in Willis Lawrence James's Song Collecting by Ellie Arman Azoulay.
Yeah, so the idea of phonographic refusal is something that is in conversation with an idea developed by anthropologist Audra Simpson, who is Mohawk, and she develops this idea of ethnographic refusal, which is something that emerged in her research with members of her own community, and the moments at which she was, as the anthropologist, invited to refuse the kind of exposure to the canon of anthropology, certain forms of information that were not meant for non-tribal members, right? So this idea is pretty widely engaged in Native American and Indigenous studies, the idea that there are sacred forms of knowledge that are not intended for just anyone. And in this case, in the context that I write about phonographic refusal, one of the things that I was trying to develop was this this way that I perceived Hurston to be using her body sort of as a barrier to this knowledge in the community setting. And so by singing the songs herself, she refused the fidelity, that the archive, desires. And she also, she was mediating. She was a mediator between the kind of collectively held knowledge, which was this repertoire of songs, and the archive's desire for the authentic performer of that repertoire, which, at this historical moment was imagined as, let's say, a prisoner, which is the project of John and Alan Lomax, who went very much in search of the authentic, performer of that collectively held repertoire. And so the figure of Leadbelly, who becomes this really important blues musician, emerges through the field work that the Lomaxes, and especially John Lomax, the senior Lomax, was doing in search of this authentic, form of sort of sound in situ, which is what field recordings are. And so phonographic refusal is the refusal of that wish by the archive or by ethnomusicology or by comparative musicology. And that's what I argue she's doing. She's not an especially, I don't know. I mean, she's a perfectly skilled singer, but her voice is not one that maybe we would associate with, a singer. and yet she doesn't care. She's just going to sing these songs and not point the microphone at the person in the community who, you know, maybe taught her the song. So that's the idea of phonographic refusal.
Thank you. I was just thinking about a little bit also in relation to modernity's ear and the question of the desire, the kind of economy of desire that these recorded objects circulate in particular in the face of you know, disappearing or basically destroyed bodies of cultural knowledge. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that and the place that these recordings have in that, within that economy, and what they were, the appeal that they had, I suppose.
Sorry, could you just rephrase that question?
Yeah, I was thinking about also in relation to some of the work in modernity's ear around the question of desire and pleasure in listening and the feminized listening subject, or the feminization of listening, and then this kind of economy of desire that is this, you know, that is the sort of where these commodified recorded sound objects circulate. And I'm just curious about that desire. Like, what is the desire for, and what is being, I mean, is it the desire for an other to sort of define this middle class subjectivity against, or is there something else going on there?
Yeah, I mean, you know, in the first book, in my first book, Modernity's Ear, I what I set out to do was to understand this this curious discovery that I made doing ethnographic research at a world music record company, which was this claim that the company understood its ideal listener to be a white woman. And I was utterly confounded by that claim. It just didn't, it was very counterintuitive for me. I didn't understand that. And when I went into the archive and began doing research, I discovered that a majority of the early comparative musicologists, which is what the field was called prior to ethnomusicology, which is what is a moniker that really became normalized in the mid-century. But prior to that, it was called comparative musicology. They were almost all white women. And so what I'm trying to understand is why does salvage audio recording become a place of kind of expressions of agency for white women in this early historical moment of the recording discipline and industries and the academic fields. And so one of the arguments I make is that there is a that there is an imagined site in the future where these sounds would be heard, that would was this sort of utopian site of political promise for these women who, you know, in the earliest period had not even won suffrage yet. And so they were not considered, in any way social equals. They were second-class citizens. And so I explore how recording became the mechanism through which that civic and political agency was sort of imagined because of the future sight of audition. And so that desire is partly, a kind of desire for essentially being equal to the white man in this future moment. Yeah, of course, there's the desire for primitivity and all that, but I think what motivates so many women in this moment to pursue audio recording is this desire for a kind of imagined sight of liberation in this moment of futurity. But I unfortunately have to go. I have to go teach. So I had a fantastic chat with you all. I'm sorry if I'm cutting it short, but
no, I didn't think so. That was just about the last question we were going to do, I think. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you again, and
thank you. That was fascinating.
And yeah, I will be in touch.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Next week, it's a kind of nice segue. We have a session on dance, on whiteness in dance, with Arabella Stanger. So thank you for coming. Thank you, Roshanak.
Thank you.
Care. Have a good rest of the day, evening.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone joining us, and thank you, Roshanak, again. Thank you, Sophie, as well.
Thanks, Colin. Bye-bye.